Okay, so welcome everybody to our first webinar of this part of the year since our last virtual conference back in April. I'm Catherine Stothart. I'm the Director of Events for the British Association for Psychological Type, and I will shortly introduce our speaker. But before I do that, I wanted to share with you our upcoming events. We are very excited that we're doing a 2-day in-person series of workshops in London in June, 14th to 15th of June. And we've got some amazing facilitators. It'll be very participative, very interactive, great opportunity to learn more about type and try things out. And we've got Susan Nash from the US, Sue Blair, Dario Nardi, Anna Krolik, Torsten Larsen from Denmark, Vicky Giovanna, Catherine Hirsch, Sterling Bates and myself. So it's going to be an amazing event. You can sign up on our new website, and I'm hoping that Nathan might pop that into the chat for me, Nathan, and then people can look it up. Thanks, Nathan. As well as our 2-day workshop in London, we've got our usual type practitioner peer support sessions, one a month, which Sue Blair is going to be running for us. And I think those are the correct dates on this slide, but that means the next one is just next week. So if you want to attend one of those, please sign up and join in with that. And then we'll be starting our October to March webinars again in October. We have a break over the summer. And as well as coming to some of those events, you can connect with us in all of these ways: LinkedIn, Facebook, X, our YouTube videos. Tonight's recording will be up on our YouTube channel, free and open access to anybody. So please feel free to share with colleagues, friends, etc. And if you haven't looked at our new website, go and have a look at it, Personality Type UK, because it's really nice, really nice. Thanks to Nick, our digital director. Okay, that's enough from me. I will stop sharing my screen so that I can introduce our speaker and also let John start sharing his slides when he's ready. So it's a real pleasure to welcome John Hackston, who is the head of thought leadership for the Myers-Briggs Company, giving us a wave there. And he's going to be talking about MBTI type and neurodiversity, a really topical, important topic. John's a chartered psychologist. He's been an MBTI practitioner since 1997. And he brings personality and type to life, helping clients to apply insights both inside and outside their work. He really doesn't need any more introduction from me. So I will just spotlight John for the recording. And basically, John, if you're ready, it's over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Catherine. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. I'll try and live up to it in the next hour and a half or so, but hey, we'll see how we go. So welcome to this session, everybody. As you can see, it's called MBTI Type and Neurodiversity, and that's very much what we're going to be talking about. But just because, you know, I don't like to do all the talking myself, I'm going to start by asking you all a question. What do you understand by this thing called neurodiversity? What do you understand by that word? By all means, shout out your answers, or perhaps put a few things in the chat. What comes to mind when you hear that phrase, neurodiversity? Let's see what sort of things you say. I'm waiting with bated breath. People who are outside the norm, Catherine says. Any other suggestions?
Differences in cognition.
Differences in cognition. Yeah. Any other suggestions? It's a way to perceive or look at things. Oh, really interesting answer there, Mark.
Huge umbrella of complexity.
Huge umbrella of complexity. I had a very complex umbrella once, but that's another story. We'll go into that. So quite a few answers there. Some quite different answers, different ways in how the brain processes information, broader, wider ways of seeing things. So there's quite a range of different answers there. And I think some of those answers perhaps reflect the idea that neurodiversity, that word, actually refers to all of us. Because strictly speaking, that word neurodiversity, as some of those answers have reflected, doesn't just apply to one group of people or to people who are different in some way. It applies actually to all of us. So Judy Singer, a sociologist, she coined that term back in 1991 and redesigned it to apply to everybody, to mean that whole range of functioning across the whole population. So actually, and I think some of the things you put in chat reflect this, actually all of us are neurodiverse. Everyone in this webinar, everyone you're going to ever meet across the course of your whole lifespan, everybody in the world, we're all neurodiverse. But within that range of neurodiversity, there are people who you might describe perhaps as neurotypical. Their mental functioning, their cognitive functioning matches what society sees as typical or normal. And I'm using those phrases society sees as quite deliberately there. Because there are also people who function, as some of you have said, in a different way. They're neurodivergent. Now, the word neurodiverse has sort of come to mean a synonym for neurodivergent, but I'm trying not to use that today. I'm trying to go and stick to the word neurodivergent because that more accurately describes those people who are different from the neurotypical, who diverge in various ways from what is seen as typical. But just because they're different, that doesn't, of course, mean that things are better or worse, or that they are better or worse in any way. Of course, society and organizations don't make things easy always for neurodivergent people. So in the words of one neurodivergent activist, we're all neurodiverse, but not all of us are marginalized for it. There's many people in the neuro majority. Some are part of what is sometimes called the neuro minority. Now, of course, this neuro minority isn't just one undifferentiated group of people. There are different forms of neurodivergence. So let me ask you to put in the chat what different types, different forms, different varieties of neurodivergence are you aware of? And again, you can shout out your answer if you want to, or just type things into the chat. What things have you heard of in describing neurodivergent? So we have ADHD, we have autism, ADD and ADHD and ASD. There's a lot of acronyms in this, and we'll talk through some of those as we go. Dyscalculia, yeah. ADHD, dyslexia, various things. Asperger's, interesting one, Asperger's. Mood disorders, perhaps processing disorders. So there's lots of different things under this umbrella. Dyspraxia, just come up from Sue Blair. So lots of different possibilities under this broad umbrella of neurodivergence. Bipolar we have as well. Now there's an interesting question here about to what extent are things mental illnesses, to what extent are things more to do with neurodiversity. In terms of things that are often seen as different forms of neurodiversity, these are some of the things, and some of these things are things you said, which perhaps come up more often than others. So first of all, we have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. Let's get the initials in the right order there. Sometimes you hear ADD, which just stands for attention deficit disorder. And in terms of what this is about, the clues in the name: attention deficit and hyperactivity. Some people with ADHD are seen as inattentive. They don't always pay attention to detail. They don't always listen. They can get distracted. And that can mean, doesn't have to mean, but can mean they make mistakes. Some people are more hyperactive or impulsive. They fidget, they can't stay still, their thoughts go everywhere. They can interrupt people. But in practice, many people show a combination of both inattention and hyperactivity, which is why the two often seen together as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Then autism or autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. And one of you mentioned Asperger's syndrome. Asperger's is a term which used to be used for what used to be called, in a slightly derogatory way, high-functioning autistics. It tends not to be used these days, partly because there have seen to be some connections between Hans Asperger, who the syndrome is named after, and the Nazi Party in the Second World War. Now that's disputed, but lots of people are staying away now from the word Asperger's for that and other reasons. And within autism spectrum disorder, there's a wide range of different behaviors. Some people with autism are going to find it quite difficult to communicate or interact with other people, maybe to understand how other people think and feel. Some people can find things like bright lights or loud noises stressful, uncomfortable, or even overwhelming, and can get anxious or upset when they have to do things in an unfamiliar way, or in unfamiliar situations, or in social events. And sometimes they may do the same things over and over again. Most people, though, won't have all of those behaviors, they just have a small subset of those. Dyscalculia is a difficulty in understanding numbers, and something that's very persistent and very definite and tends to last through the lifetime. And also for some people, it also means not understanding how shapes work, about distances, about volumes, maybe keeping track of time, or spatial directions, how to get to places. Dyslexia, most people have heard of. People with dyslexia can read or write slowly. They might confuse the order of letters and words, get confused or by letters that look similar. So B and D, get those the wrong way around, for example, may have poor or inconsistent spelling. Maybe better understanding, remembering information when it's sent to them rather than when it's written down. Dyspraxia, developmental coordinating disorder, the clues in the name there. These are people who have difficulty with movement and coordination, and that can affect things like sports, like learning to drive, or if you think about things like fine motor coordination, things like writing. Obsessive compulsive disorder. These are people who have obsessive, unwanted, unpleasant, repeated thoughts and try to alleviate those by undertaking compulsive behaviors like cleaning things, washing their hands, checking things, rechecking things, hoarding, in an attempt to try and relieve that anxiety. And people with Tourette's syndrome make sounds and movements, tics they have no control over. Might be physical, like blinking or jerking parts of your body, or verbal, like grunting or clicking your tongue. Now, the stereotype of Tourette's, you've probably seen this, about people who swear all the time. And actually, that's not very common. Only a small percentage of people with Tourette's will do this. Now, some of you mentioned various other things in terms of different forms of neurodivergence. These are probably some of the ones that you see most frequently, but there's a whole load of other things we could put there. And even some of these things people argue over is obsessive compulsive disorder, something to do with neurodiversity, or is it something to do with mental illness? And people will argue the toss about where this fits. But these perhaps are some of the things. Yeah. And thanks to, I only just saw your comment, my son is ADD. I call it attention difference without the disorder. And that's a really useful point. It actually preempts something I'm going to say in just a short while. So hold that thought. So lots of the forms of neurodivergence around. A couple of things I should say. First of all, I'm sort of talking about these conditions as if they were separate, as if they're these different things. But in practice, lots of people are going to be neurodivergent in different ways. In some research that we've carried out recently, and I'll talk about that in more detail in a moment, 70%, 70% of people diagnosed with one neurodivergent condition had also been diagnosed with at least one more condition. And 21% have been diagnosed with 3 or more conditions. So in practice, people will typically show a number of these different things. And the second thing I should say is that I found myself slipping into the language there of saying conditions. And lots of these things date back to a medical model of looking at people. And if you look at the names of some of these things, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autism spectrum disorder, Asperger's syndrome, you can see that these were originally conceptualized as disorders, as dysfunctions, as disabilities, as deficits, as impairments. And that's really not the case, or not straightforwardly the case. And this was part of a reason for coming up with the idea of neurodiversity in the first place, to say that these people aren't necessarily disordered, but maybe they are different. So if we look at ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and yet, there we go, deficit and disorder, bang in the name of this thing. Pardon me. And if you look at how ADHD is often described, you'll see a list of deficits or disorders. And sometimes these things are even described as symptoms, going back to that medical model again. Things like being restless, being hyperactive, being fidgety, that's the hyperactivity bit. Inattentive, distractible, easily bored, that's the attention deficit bit. Maybe impulsive, maybe takes risks, doesn't follow instructions, often feels they don't perhaps fit with the way that many organizations work, feel they're a little bit different from other people. But if these people have a deficit in some ways, maybe they have an abundance in others. If they have a disorder here, maybe they have gifts or abilities over there. And if we look at that, then yes, we'll do see that. So perhaps these people can be restless or hyperactive, but they can bring a lot of energy to things. Perhaps they can be distractible and easily bored and attentive, but often people with ADHD show what's called hyperfocus. So when it's something that they are actually really interested in or motivated by, bang, they focus on it. They put a lot of energy into it, they focus on it to an nth degree, they really concentrate on that for hours and hours. They're impulsive and they take risks, but actually sometimes you need people to take risks. And sometimes you need people who can cope with risky situations. They don't necessarily do things in the standard way. They don't necessarily find it easy to follow instructions. But that means that they may do things in different ways, and that can be really useful and can lead to a great deal of creativity. Maybe they've worked out that perhaps don't fit in the way that things often work, but often leads to them becoming more self-aware and recognizing these things in themselves and developing resilience to cope with those situations. One of the things you will find anecdotally, I don't have any hard evidence on this, is that people with ADHD are overrepresented amongst entrepreneurs and people who create startups. One example of that I know of is someone called Nancy Doyle, Dr. Nancy Doyle. She's a psychology professor at Birkbeck, University of London, but she also founded a company called Genius Within, which is a company especially set up to help organizations work with neurodivergent people. And she herself has ADHD. She started off this company, she was the CEO of it. A couple of years ago, she stepped back from being a CEO, not because she couldn't do it as such, but actually she got the company to a size where it didn't need somebody like her anymore. It needed someone who was more things on an everyday basis, looking at keeping the status quo going. So she moved herself into a place where she was the chief research officer, where she could use some of this energy, this focus on things she was motivated by, this creativity. So ADHD, be called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but perhaps it's really more about difference. And we have a dyslexia and ADD or AD, so that combination of things about things being used in the past. And I'll comment about the system about the system not knowing what to do with these people, I think is very relevant. I saw a talk by Nancy Doyle just the other day, and she was talking about working with the Metropolitan Police in the UK. And one of the things she was talking about was that police officers have to be generalists. But she found that two people with two very different forms of neurodiverse conditions. One person was incredibly good at looking at videos and crime scenes and working out all these things that people had noticed. Another person was really good at the interpersonal stuff. Both were about to leave the police force because they were forced to be generalists and couldn't actually specialize in the stuff they were interested in and the stuff they were good at. One of the things that's worth mentioning, and I know some of you in this group already have personal experience of neurodivergence, is that it isn't as unusual as you might think. So, for example, around 2% of adults are being diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. That might not sound like much, but let's compare that with type. That's more than people who have preferences for INFJ, more than people who have preferences for INTJ. Latest estimates, about 7% of the global population have ADHD. That's more than all those individual types, and more than have a dominant function of introverted intuition. Probably about 15% of the population are affected to a greater or lesser degree by dyslexia. That's more than any individual type. Perhaps around 20% of the population are neurodivergent in one or more ways. Again, more than any individual type, a minority, but a significant minority. Now, a lot of what I'm talking about today is going to be based around two projects. First of all, because neurodiversity, last year, I put together some guidelines for using the MBTI with neurodivergent people. It has those guidelines, it has concrete suggestions and recommendations. For those people who haven't come across these areas before, it describes different forms of neurodiversity, and I outline some of the existing research. But one of the things I found was there actually isn't very much research. There's not a great deal of research into personality and neurodiversity and neurodivergence in general. And there's, to use a technical phrase, bugger all to do with type in particular. So what I've been doing this year is carrying out some research into how type relates to neurodivergence, and also how that plays into people with various forms of neurodivergence, how they view the workplace, how they experience the workplace, and how that relates to other things around them at work. Now, I haven't written them up yet, but I'm crunching the numbers. I'm going to draw on some of that today. Now, in that research, we had 1,361 people, but it's not a representative section of a population, because the way we got this data, one of the things we did was to ask people who'd taken the MBTI over the last 6 months if they'd like to take part in future research, and some of them said yes, so we're in there. But we also went out to groups on LinkedIn and Facebook for neurodivergent people and asked them to take part in the survey as well. So what we've got is a survey where people with various forms of neurodiversity are overrepresented. But that's fine, because that's what we wanted, because what we wanted to do was to actually be able to say, how do these people compare with other people? So, for example, 16% of people in our sample have been diagnosed with ADHD, compared with 7% in the population as a whole. 5% have been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, compared with 3% in the population as a whole. And one of the reasons we're interested in doing this was that we knew from other evidence, and we found out from our own research, that organizations aren't always the best place for neurodivergent people to prosper. Sad but true, but if we know what was happening, perhaps we can start to do something about it. So, for example, one of the things we did was to ask people a whole set of questions about how included they felt they were by their co-workers, how supported they were by their manager, how valued they were by their organization, and so on. We put that together into a scale of how included you felt to be yourself to be at work. And what you have in this graph is the average level of that scale for people who were diagnosed with ADHD and so on. And what you can see reading from the left to the right, I said people who were diagnosed with ADHD felt less included than people who weren't diagnosed but were pretty certain they had ADHD, who felt less included than people who just thought they had ADHD, who felt less included than people who said, I don't think I've got ADHD, who felt less included than people who said, I'm really certain I haven't got ADHD. So in other words, the more likely you were to have ADHD, the less included you felt in the workplace. Obviously, individual exceptions, but on the whole. For those of you who like statistics, that is a statistically significant one-way analysis of variance. Just thought I'd get that in there. And a statistically significant correlation of minus 0.225. If you look at some of the other findings, we also find that those people with ADHD were more likely than others to feel understood, otherwise causing problems, felt more stressed at work, and had lower levels of job satisfaction. So let's try and look at this in a bit more detail. And we're going to look at ADHD in particular. But before I do that, I'm going to ask you to carry out a quick quiz. So I've been talking for a little while, so a little activity for you. So for this activity, you will need two important things. You will need a piece of paper, and you will need the writing implement of your choice. I'm using a Myers-Briggs pen, of course, but you can use whatever you've got handy. And what I'd like you to do in that piece of paper is write the numbers 1 to 6 in a column on the sheet of paper, leaving a little bit of space at the right-hand side. I'll just give you a moment to do that. And some of you have either got bored already or don't have a piece of paper handy, but that's okay. Okay. That's a nice big sheet of paper there, Dave. So write down column, leaving a bit of space at the right-hand side. Okay. Okay. Let's look at that number 1 that you've written at the top of the page. I'd like you to have a read of this, a look at this statement. How often do you have trouble wrapping up the final details of a project once the challenging parts have been done? Think about how you would answer that question. If that is never the case for you, write never beside number 1. If it's really the case, write rarely. If it's sometimes the case, write sometimes. If it's often the case, write often. If it's very often the case, which I guess includes always as well, write very often. Okay? So you should have a sheet of paper, 1 to 6 down the column, and one of those words written alongside number 1. Everybody got that? Good stuff. Right then, we've got another 5 statements. Statements 2 through to 6. So have a read of each of those, and beside each of those, write the appropriate word. Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. And give me a wave or a thumbs up or whatever gesture you feel is appropriate once you've done it. This is where I can sit back and spend some time drinking my evening gin. Or water. Okay, Sue's finished. Catherine's finished. Mark's nodding. Lynn's finished. Over Lynn's finished. Should call you Lynn D and Lynn H. Okay, and I can see a few people said things in the chat. Let me just check that. When I get my mouse to work. Yeah. Sarah's finished. Tamsin's finished. Okay, I think most people are probably just about there. Okay. Now, these aren't things I've just written. These are actually items, in fact, they form part A of the Adult ADHD Self-Report Scale ASRS-V 1.1 symptom checklist. Symptom checklist, there's that medical model again. And this is an actual screening test, one better word, for ADHD. And the way this works is if you look at your answers to those 6 questions, if you've chosen sometimes, often, or very often for any of the first 3 questions, or often or very often for the last 3 questions, if there are 4 or more marks in the shaded areas, then this screen has suggested that maybe you have ADHD. Now, in fact, the wording that is used in the actual assessment is, if 4 more marks appear in the darkly shaded boxes within part A, and this is part A, then the patient has symptoms highly consistent with ADHD. You notice that word patient there. In adults, and further investigation is warranted. So, some disclaimers. I am not qualified to diagnose you as ADHD. I don't think this particular assessment diagnoses you as ADHD. At best, it means that a medical professional might say, worthwhile talking to this person in a bit more detail. But you can see the sorts of behaviors that might relate to ADHD. And you may see why perhaps there are differences between things like diagnosis and people who may have behaviors which might seem linked to ADHD. So we've already seen, for example, that in our sample, 16% of that group had been diagnosed with ADHD. We also put those checklist items in the survey, and only 36% were positive on the checklist. So a lot more people came out as, have these people got symptoms of ADHD? But actually had been diagnosed. So there's a number of things that could be happening here. It may be that behaviors that are seen as characteristic of ADHD, maybe they aren't, or maybe they're much more widely spread through a population than we might think. And it may be that ADHD is actually underdiagnosed in general. And maybe it's a combination of both of those things. But I think what we're saying here is perhaps it's not so easy to tease apart always things that doctors may see as symptomatic of ADHD, but other people may see as part of perhaps personality. And yes, well, you're in both camps. So I'm not sure if you get a badge or anything for that today, but thanks for letting us know. So let's think a little bit more about ADHD and how it relates to the workplace. And with that checklist, again, we have found the same things as we found for diagnosis, but people who are seen as maybe having ADHD in the checklist, they feel less included, they're more likely to see their behaviors misunderstood, they feel more stressed at work, and they tend to have lower levels of job satisfaction. And for those who like stats, these are significant on a independent samples t-test, and those are effect sizes coding these written at the top there. So let's think about how this relates to type, because it might help us to unpick some of these behaviors if we actually understood the relationship between ADHD and type. So here's some questions for you. We're going to put you into breakouts in a moment just to have a conversation about this. How do you think ADHD in particular relates to psychological type? Are there particular type preferences, people with particular type preferences who may be more or less likely to show those behaviors? And you might want to think how that relates to just the preference pairs, or to the dominant functions, the favored process, or even the whole type. And any speculations as to why that might be as well. And Tracy, you have some ideas already, but you can share that with your colleagues in a breakout group in just a second. Any questions about what I'm asking you to do? I'm just going to give you a quick 5 minutes to have a chat with some of your colleagues, some of your co-delegates, to actually think about how you answer these questions. So I'm not sure if Catherine or Nick who's going to wave a magic wand.
Yeah, I'm waving the magic wand, John. So I'll open the rooms now,
Where
and you
it
should,
is, wave a.
yeah, you should get an invitation on your screen inviting you to join one of the groups and have a good chat. So I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay.
Just, I haven't stopped it yet. Just give me a second. Here we go.
Okay.
Pause.
So I think we had 3 groups. Anybody like to say what they thought in terms of how ADHD might relate to type? Over to you. I probably neglected to say appoint a spokesperson, so just go for it.
We had a comment on the P preference, which I think obviously, comes up an awful lot of the time.
Yeah.
Yes, and to follow up on that, we did as well in our group, and there was we were starting to have a conversation around whether the S or the N preference would be more correlated with ADHD, and just how interesting that would be, and some personal experiences in our group of both of those, both SP and MP.
Okay, so P, there's some conversation about is it SP or NP or both? Any other comments from any of the other groups? Okay. So
sorry,
when you
John,
look at what people have, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we also started off the conversation about whether we thought extroversion was more dominant in ADHD
Okay,
or
interesting.
ADD. But that was a conversation, wasn't a conclusion.
So,
yeah. Also, John, what we were saying is that, and certainly in my experience, that all types have this, but those with a P preference don't recover from it as well. Those with a J preference have got enough skills to get themselves through the system, whereas those with a P preference have to struggle a whole lot more to sort of manage themselves, and so it becomes more obvious more early.
Okay, that's a really interesting point, Sue, and it may be that your ADHD is pulling in one direction, your J preference is pulling in another direction, so the J.
John, I'm sorry. I've accidentally muted you because I was trying to mute other people. I apologize profusely, and I think you might have to unmute yourself. I don't seem to be able to do it for you.
Hello, is that better?
Great, thank you. Sorry about
Welcome
that, everyone.
Back. So I think what I was saying was, just building on what Sue was saying, about this idea that the tools that, if for want of a better phrase, that your judging preference helps you with, might help you to pull against some of the things you can see at the left-hand side of that slide there. Now, what we found in our survey, and well, before I say that, one of the things which people have speculated about is very much about the perceiving preference, and that's often been said from other people over time. And then there has been people saying, well, should it be extroverted sensing, SP? That's more likely to show some of these restless behaviors. Or is actually does N come in there? How does this all work? This is what we found in the research. In terms of a diagnosis of ADHD, which isn't necessarily the same as having the behaviors associated with ADHD. There was no significant difference between people with an extroversion preference and introversion preference, but people who had an intuitive preference and a perceiving preference were more likely to have a diagnosis across the board, and to a slightly lesser extent, people with a feeling preference. And in terms of favorite process, dominant function, the people who are most likely to be diagnosed were people with introverted feeling as their dominant function, and the most likely individual type was INFP. 25% of people with INFP preferences in our sample had been diagnosed with ADHD. But as we digest that information, there's a really important point to be made, which is this: type is not the same as neurodivergence. So in our sample, for example, 20% of people with perceiving preference were diagnosed with ADHD, a fifth. Seems like a big number, but there's a couple of big buts in there, for want of a better phrase. First of all, this is going to be an overestimate for a population as a whole. Remember that in our sample, 16% have been diagnosed with ADHD, whereas in the population, it's more like 6 or 7%. So it may be that it's more likely that something like 8 or 9 or 10% of people with a perceiving preference in the population have been diagnosed with ADHD. And a second important point, of course, that even if 20% of people perceiving preference have been diagnosed with ADHD, 80% haven't been. So don't forget that most people perceiving preference do not have ADHD. Most people with introverted feeling do not have ADHD. Most people with preferences for INFP do not have ADHD. So the relationship between type and any form of neurodivergence, ADHD in particular, might be like that. There's an overlap, but they are not the same thing. But as Sue's alluded to, knowing someone's type, knowing what that brings to the picture, knowing what ADHD brings to the picture, together might help us to actually work with that individual to help them achieve whatever their goals are. We also looked at the checklist data, and this is what we found. We found again a difference for intuition, feeling, and perceiving, and a statistically significant but smaller difference on ENI, with people with an introversion preference more likely to come out on our checklist. And similarly, in terms of the failure process, again, introverted feeling, closely followed by introverted thinking, and then extroverted intuition. Okay. So we spent a bit of time looking at ADHD. We'll go on to look at some of the practical things you might want to do in a moment. But before we do, let's just quickly look at some of those other forms of neurodivergence. Now, partly we looked at ADHD because it's one of the most commonly seen forms of neurodivergence in the population, and it's certainly one of the most common in our sample. And as you can see, there's many fewer people, if that's the right phrase, with diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, OCD, dyslexia, and so on in the people who took part in our survey. But there's enough people with things like ASD, autism spectrum disorder, to look at things in a bit more detail. So if we look at people with autism spectrum disorder, these people can have challenges in their lives and at work, but can also bring strengths, just like any of us can. So typically, literally, they do trifles that really learn very well. They may not understand abstract concepts. They can find it difficult to read people, to understand other people's emotions, or even to express their own emotions, sometimes even to understand their own emotions. They like things to be set up in the same way, day by day, hour by hour. They like to have an exact routine. And if there's change, especially if that change happens suddenly, they can find that really quite distressing. They can be oversensitive or even undersensitive to new stimuli, to light, to sound, to taste, or touch, and they can really get focused on and concentrate on one little aspect or task or interest over here, neglecting everything else that's going on over there. But that can also bring strengths. They can have great attention to detail, very precise. They can really retain information in a very accurate way. They may focus on a small number of interests, and that means they often have really in-depth expertise or knowledge in those areas. They're typically logical, they're analytical, they like routine, but that means they often are very punctual, very rule following, very dependable, very reliable, and able to focus on things for long periods when about to do so. And you might not necessarily think of someone being creative if you see the list of things at the left-hand side of your screen, but just bringing a different viewpoint to things brings new ideas and new possibilities and new concepts and leads to creativity. And again, I could add many more bullet points at the bottom of both of those lists there. But hopefully that gives you a feel for what autism spectrum disorder is typically about, at least for people in the workplace. When we looked at our data, we found that the only real personality difference at preference per level was an ENI. People with an introversion preference much more likely to have an autism diagnosis than people with an extroversion preference, especially perhaps people with introverted sensing as their favorite process. And this fits in fairly well with what little research we have in the area previously. Something else I just like to touch on. Both personality and autism spectrum disorder related to how included people felt at work. So typical people with an extroversion preference felt a bit more included at work by people with introversion preference, irrespective of whether or not they had autism spectrum disorder. People who are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder felt less included than people who weren't diagnosed, and so on. Up the graph, you can see at the right-hand side. And what's interesting, well, it's all interesting, but what's really interesting is what happens if you put those together. Because if you look at people with an introversion preference who have ASD, that relationship very much works. People who are diagnosed with ASD, who have an introversion preference, feel much less included than people who haven't been diagnosed with an introversion preference. For extroverts, that relationship doesn't hold. So, as I said, I'm crunching the numbers. There's going to be lots more of these little niggles in the data, but this will relate in a different way to some of the things that you were talking about before, Sue. That this idea that if we use other parts of our personality, that might help people, in this case, perhaps people with an extroversion preference, to adapt in some ways to the behaviors
Well, we've had a few frozen moments from John. We're back. John, you froze a little bit then.
Take my headphones off. Oops. Can you hear me there?
Yeah, we can hear you. You did froze for a little bit longer then than the previous times.
That wasn't my internet. That was my system saying, I don't distinct your speakers. It's all back again now. So there you go. What is the technology? So diagnosed with ASD with different extroverts and introverts, and I'm sure I'll find a lot more of these things. So I delve into the data, and these are things which will inform the new guidelines that we bring out. Other forms of neurodivergence are type OCD, a slight tendency for introversion and judging. introverted intuition most likely, but not a huge effect. Dyslexia, really no relationship at all. That's been found in other research with other types of personality questionnaire. Dyspraxia, developmental coordination disorder. This is probably just a little chance finding, but people with a judging preference are more likely than those with perceiving preference to think they have dyspraxia, but there's no difference in diagnosis. So that may be just a random finding. Dyscalculia, no relationship with type. Syndrome. People with an introversion preference were more likely to be diagnosed with Tourette's, less likely to be certain they don't have Tourette's. That might sound a little bit odd, but it's actually been found in other research with the Big Five and with the Ising personality questionnaire. So it's conceivable, I guess, that there may be some deep-seated relationship between introversion and Tourette's. What I think is more likely is that if you think of someone having Tourette's, having to suppress tics, whether verbal or physical, having to be very contained and controlled in their body language and what they say, that's going to induce them to behave in ways that we might see as typical of introverts, whatever their underlying personality preference really is. And just finally, before we finish looking at research, we looked at how preference pairs related to people having any form of neurodivergent diagnosis. So whether they had ADHD or ASD or OCD or a combination of these or any form of diagnosis, what we found is that people with introversion, intuition, feeling, and perceiving preference were more likely to be diagnosed. And for those of you like me who are old enough to remember the decision rule about which direction you might score hand-scored type results, or to think about what types might be less favoured by Western society, maybe there's an interesting link in there. Okay, that's enough of research for now, I think. Let's look at some of the practical issues. Okay. Let's, oops, I beg your pardon, not too far. So I was going to ask you this. My slide was just going to ask you this question anyway. In the last year, how often have you used the MBTI assessment with someone with ADHD? So I'm going to actually ask either Catherine or Nick to launch a poll on this. So in the poll, you should see that question pop up on your screen in a moment. So have you never, at least to your knowledge, used the MBTI with someone with ADHD? Is it once, 2 or 3 times, 4 or 5 times, or more 5 times? So if you'd like to answer those questions, please.
John, if it's irrelevant to us, I mean, I'm not a profiler. Do you want me to just not answer?
You can just not answer, but we'll know you're there, Lynn. We're still caring for you. It's okay. Okay. So a lot of people have answered. Just another moment or two. Okay. Now, Catherine, I don't know, because I'm not familiar with this latest version of Zoom, where people are seeing that poll. Are people seeing that poll on their screens?
I've just clicked
Oh, there we go.
share results. So there's a danger that Nick and I are both doing things at the same time here.
Yeah.
Can people see the results now?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm seeing thumbs up there. So all the people who answered, 71% never, at least to your knowledge, 40% once, that's just one person, 40% just one person, 2 or 3 times. So most of you haven't come across, in terms of using the MBTI, people with ADHD in the recent past. Can we move that away now? I don't know if people need to click that away or anything like that. Again, we asked this question. We actually asked this question as part of a different survey. We have a short survey which is designed for practitioners. So if you're a practitioner yourself, you might want to look at that QR code. And I'll show you that again later. And have a go of that survey, because we already have 42 people filling it in so far. but this is what we found. Slightly more than yourselves. 56% said never, and therefore less than half had come across someone with ADHD in MBTI assessment in the last year. And given the number of people out there and the number of profiles many people will look at over the course of a year, that seems for me quite a small number. Or we could ask why. And that might be something you might want to discuss in the next exercise. So let me see. It is 4 minutes past 8. We need to finish at 8:30. Is that right, Catherine? So
Yes.
I'm going to give you 10 minutes of this task, not 15, despite what it says on the slide. So imagine, if you will, you're intending to use the MBTI assessment with the client, but discover they have ADHD. If I say discover, that sounds a bit dramatic. There's nothing untoward in this. This client has ADHD. So in your groups, you've been working with groups, I'd like you to think about the following questions. Would either you or they have any concerns about using MBTI with them? If you do have concerns, what might those concerns be? There may be none, which is fine. But if there are any concerns, what might they be? And how could you allay or deal with those concerns? Any particular actions you might want to take when you're administering the questionnaire, when people are filling it in the first place, or when you're giving them feedback or helping to find best fit, and any other questions or concerns you might touch on. Okay? Any questions about what I'm asking you to do? You may not find it easy to see this slide once you go into your groups, so by all means take a screenshot or picture on your phone. Any questions about the task I'm asking you to do? In that case, I think an invite has popped up. Go to your rooms and I'll see you in 10 minutes. Have fun.
And I'm just going to pause the recording, not send. There we go.
Welcome back, everybody. You just interrupted Catherine and me having an extremely boring conversation about different things on the new version of Zoom. But back in the real world, let's have the comments from the groups. So, anyone like to go with, as a spokesperson for their group, with anything they said about concern, etc.? Well, I wonder if I just cut out there. So I want to go as a spokesperson for their group.
Tamsin and Mark, shall I offer up some of the things that we said in our group? So John, we were talking about maybe some of the concerns being around the fact that a lot of people with ADHD or ADD can mask at work. And so therefore answering the questions, they would, sometimes their concerns might be, how honestly do I answer these? Do I answer these in the context of the culture and the expectations that I have and play my role in the workplace, or do I do it authentically? And if it is authentically, what authenticity is that with?
And it may be that our masking has become so second nature.
Yeah.
But that's how we answer it anyway. Yeah. So masking. Anything else?
Yeah, so I was in a group with Sue, Lynn, and Dave, and I recently used the MBTI with an organisation with a very senior leadership team, and one of the leadership team had ADHD, and actually they were not happy that we were using the MBTI, and it became quite a contentious issue throughout the whole project. I downloaded your report, John, the MBTI report, and shared it with her, and we went through it with her, but it didn't really allay her fears. I think she was very concerned about what we're going to do with it and what we achieve, and so there were a lot of concerns about us using, well, her in particular, about using the MBTI.
And was it the MBTI specifically, or was it personality measurement in general?
Yeah, it was the MBTI specifically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Were there any specific things that she was worried about?
I think the use of it, the appropriateness of it, use of it, was it going to be fair? Was it going to be objective? What decisions we're going to make out of it? I mean, we were trying to really build a team. It was kind of a broken team, and we're trying to bring them together, but it didn't really allay her fears, and actually she refused to do it in the end. Which is fine, you know. We weren't insisting they did it, but I did read that report, and I felt, yeah, perhaps if I'd read that report, maybe to go to the second question, if I'd read that report, the article from the MBTI company on neurodiversity, I think maybe we would have introduced it differently. I think,
yeah,
we're kind of on the back foot at that point.
Yeah.
Perhaps we didn't put as much thought into how this individual would receive that, you know.
Okay. So there may be times that are really very difficult like that. Any other comments?
In our one of the things we discussed is the potential for a mistype to occur because of a correlation with any of these neurodiverse conditions. So for instance, if it's true that, you know, perceivers may on average tend to be more ADHD, if someone has a judging preference to judging, but they also have ADHD attributes, they may mistakenly believe that they're a perceiver because they don't understand like the nuances of each of them, and I think this also, looking at some of the stats you bring up, this also calls into question like what is normality? Because
it becomes a huge question. I think there's something very interesting that you just said there, Nathan. You said perceivers may have the potential to be ADHD. I think we should approach it from the other side. People with the ADHD might be more likely to have a perceiving than a judging preference because it's that way round. The numbers are that way round. The vast majority of people with perceiving preference ain't going to have ADHD. And I think it's important to think about it that way round. I think some of the things about pulling things apart like that are really about what you get up to in feedback and exactly how you talk through the questions. And I've got a little slide on that in just a moment as well. But thank you for that. Any other comments or questions?
I was thinking that there's a nervousness around assessments for people who are neurodiverse.
Yes.
Not only from the point of what they're going to do with the results, but just any kind of testing.
Yes.
So letting, you know, what you can do to help them is say, look, this isn't a test. You can't have a good or a bad personality. That's not what this is about. This is about, you know, looking at your strengths and looking at potential blind spots, which all of us have.
Yeah.
But, you know, I know that there's a nervousness around assessments. I think one of the things I heard a long time ago is for multiple choice questions in particular, which a lot of exams are these days, is that if you have a certain preference, and I think ADD and ADHD is one of them, or maybe intuiting and perceiving, everything looks like a possibility. So for you to narrow down a multiple choice question to A, B, C, or D is much, much harder for somebody with certain perhaps neurodiversity than it is for people who SJs, for example.
And there's no argument that the MBTI has a slight advantage that it's got two choices. It's also been said that the word pairs are more difficult for people to answer than the other questions. So there's a whole range of things there. I think in terms of what you said, and actually I'm going to put slightly conscious of time, so I'm just going to put this next slide up. These are some of the things that came out of the research. So both out of concerns from practitioners, from that short survey, which hopefully something, and also from comments from some people who knew their type, who had various sorts of neurodivergence, who filled the questionnaire. And that first statement there, I think, speaks to what you were saying, Nick, and what you were saying too, about initial skepticism, but a willingness to engage. And you're absolutely right, Sue. Lots of people who are neurodivergent have been through so many tests and so many assessments, and I get suspicious of them. There's also a degree of suspicion out there about how results are going to be used. And there is an argument that when personality assessments are used in selection situations, that is going to disadvantage people or with various different forms of neurodivergence. And really getting people's minds away from that, I think, is really important. One of the things you also see a little bit is actually the opposite. Sometimes people with ADHD or ASD, they have spent so much time on the internet trying to find out about themselves and done so many free, quote, MBTIs, unquote, that they get an idea of what their type is, which may be quite some distance from what reality is. So sometimes there's that to unpick as well. What about people with masking or hiding neurodivergence? We've talked, Sue, about the difficulties of filling in multiple choices, and for that and other reasons, typically people may need more time. Teasing apart what's about personality, what's about the condition. Something that was mentioned by a few of the people in our survey is about fonts, clarity of written stuff, especially perhaps in materials you produce yourselves, having things that are easy and quick to read, having sans serif fonts rather than lovely things like Times New Roman, which look great, but all these little tiny bits and things make things more difficult for people with some neurodiverse conditions. And thinking about feedback in many of the group feedback may not be appropriate for all sorts of reasons, for time reasons, for people who want to not reveal a lot about themselves in a group, and so on and so forth. And out of that result, then we have some recommendations. Which aren't ambiguous, which don't include loads of metaphors or non-sequiturs or unusual ways of saying things. As one of you said, being really clear about the purpose right up front, the process that client control, they decide their best fit type. Really spending time before anything happens, if you possibly can, dealing with any questions and concerns. You talk, Nick, about, knowing about this in the first place, you might be better prepared. Have a distraction-free, quiet environment. For some people, reading things aloud, taking time, and be prepared to add context. We normally say, if someone says, what does this question mean? We just say, well, just say what you think it means. For some people, that's, what the hell are you talking about? So be prepared, if necessary, to add that context and a little bit of explanation. I'll be around for questions, even when people are completing the questionnaire, even if they're doing it online. If possible, have them to have a way of contacting you to ask any questions that they have. And in feedback, always ask why. And this goes on to really the thing that you were saying, Nathan. So, for example, one question that we might often ask in feedback is, how do you typically operate in meetings? And this is getting an extroversion introversion. And if your client says, well, normally I don't say a lot, I don't contribute a great deal, your initial reaction might be, well, clearly they've got a passive introversion. But ask why, as I'm sure you all will anyway. Because it might be, for example, that because they are coming at things from a different place to all their colleagues, their contributions have never been appreciated, they've never been taken seriously, so they've just stopped contributing. I'm just not getting involved in this. Or there's someone with Tourette's syndrome, and all the energy in the meeting is taken up with suppressing tics. Or there's someone with ADHD, and we're just trying to keep things together and sit still in the meeting on something that really isn't interesting at all. And it's really quite painful sitting there. So never assume, always explore, always ask why. And we've talked about masking already. But one of the things we did find in our research is that things like knowing your type can be really useful, can be really powerful for some neurodivergent people. It explained my brain to me and helped me lean more to positives, but focus on my perceived deficits or normal things I just wasn't able to do. It was the MBTI assessment that first got me to push for my own diagnosis, This maybe was someone who had autism spectrum disorder and didn't really realize it, and did the MBTI, and that really helped them to decide more about who they were. I'm not going to read this in detail because I'm conscious of time, but again, I could give you more quotes like this. I always take a screenshot of that and I provide the slides afterwards. Lots of quotes from people who are neurodivergent who say, actually, this has been really useful and really powerful. Now, Nick mentioned that type a neurodiversity report. It includes all that sort of information, all that useful information. And you can download it from there. I'm going to quickly go through that because I'm conscious of the time, so I'd like to quickly sum up. So we've talked about what these words mean about being neurodiverse, about neurodiversity, about being neurodiverse. We talked about these different forms of neurodiversity. We've talked quite a lot about ADHD, partly because it's one of the forms of neurodiversity you may see more frequently, what it is, how it might work at work in the workplace, and how it relates to type and some of the implications of that. And we've touched on other forms of neurodivergence as well. And we've did an exercise about how you might think about using type with neurodivergent people with ADHD in particular. This is a phrase I heard someone with ADHD use just the other day, ADHDers. So this is a phrase she used to describe herself, so I've stuck it in the slide there. So what might we think about dealing with this information next? Well, please do complete that practitioner survey. And there's the QR code, or you should prefer good old-fashioned links. There's a link. And you might want to exist those guidelines you heard Nick talking about as well. We're going to update those guidelines once we finish the research, but there's lots of really useful stuff in there already. Or if you're rather not bother with QR codes or links, just drop me a line and I can always send this stuff to you. Okay, so I have to beg your abject apologies and abase myself in front of you and wear a sackcloth coat and cover my head in ashes because we are 1 minute over our time. So my apologies for that. However, if you've got any spare time, if you don't really need to run off immediately, very happy to answer any additional questions, any further questions that you've got. Over to you.
I wonder what on earth you were going to say, John, then.
What was the idea,
mea culpa for? That's been fantastic. And yes, we're happy to stay on for a few more questions. I'll stop the recording in just a moment. Before I stop the recording, though, I will just say thank you to John on behalf of everybody. What a fascinating and thorough description and of the different forms of neurodiversity or neurodivergence, and I'm a little bit better informed than I was when I joined today. And I think we're really privileged to hear the latest research that John's been doing that isn't even published yet. And John's always been a big supporter of our association, so really heartfelt thanks to John for a wonderful presentation. I'll stop the recording. And then if anybody does want to ask questions, feel free.